Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our Lunch and Learn today on everything you've ever wanted to know about evaluations. Today we have Fiona Rattray, who is going to be our presenter, and I will let you introduce yourself further, Fiona. Thank you so much for presenting on this much needed topic for all of our registrants today. Thank you.
You're most welcome. It's a topic really close to my heart. Um, I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to my background, and then I'm going to switch off my camera so that you can really focus on the slides. And also because I have a very big, annoying cat sitting right next to me, and he likes to get up and like shove his butt in front of the camera, and I don't want to subject any of you to that. So my background, I'm not a neuropsychologist. I work for Putnam Independent Living Services as a parent training and information centre specialist. However, I do have a background as a special education teacher in the UK. And as part of the work that I did in the UK, I did actually train to conduct evaluations for students with specific learning disabilities. In addition to that, I'm the parent of two adult children on the autism spectrum. So between that and my professional experience, both as a teacher and a parent and training information centre specialist, I have had a lot of exposure, if you like, to evaluations over the years. And I feel very passionate about parents being able to really understand and engage with the evaluations. So without further ado, I am going to turn off my video and we're going to launch into the webinar. Okay, so what I want to do first of all is talk about a parent that I've been working with recently, and that parent had just received a speech language evaluation when they reached out to me, and she was really perplexed to see a score of 93 on this articulation evaluation that she'd had for her son, which is right in the average range, and she was really concerned that it meant her child no longer needed services for speech. But if we drill down into the report that the speech therapist had written, there was actually, in the middle of all that professional jargon, a very small, easy to miss phrase. And the phrase was stimulable for the sound, which might not mean a lot to you or I. But if we look into what that actually means, it actually carries real weight. Because what it means is, with some help, your child can say the sound correctly. In other words, your child is making progress, but they still need support to get there on their own. That little phrase may be the difference between dismissing services too soon and giving a child the chance to develop fully clear, confident speech. So how on earth is a parent supposed to figure this out? We have another example here. So just take a look at that for a second or two. What's your gut reaction to this language sample summary? And I'm not picking on speech language pathologists. This is the way that they're trained. This is, and to another speech language pathologist, this makes sense. But how does it feel to us as a parent? Are you confused? Are you overwhelmed by the jargon? What's a morpheme, for example? What does MLU mean? Is this bad? What does it mean my child should or shouldn't be able to do? Does it mean they're really behind? Oh, I didn't realize they were having such a hard time with grammar. Or is this going to affect reading and writing? So it would help massively, wouldn't it, if we had this written in plainer language? So let's do that. So here's an example of it written in plainer language. Okay, a sample of the child's speech showed that their sentences were shorter than expected for their age. They often left out helping words like is and are, and used the wrong verb tenses, saying he go instead of he goes, for example. Okay, that makes a lot more sense to you and I as parents. So one small part of an evaluation like this can really throw us off the task of trying to advocate for our children. Another question, average on a test, it means no problem, right? Well, let's go back to the parent I mentioned earlier. Her confusion was completely understandable if you think about it. What she was actually seeing at home were daily struggles with speaking clearly and expressing thoughts, both with articulation and stammering. And that just didn't match the picture that was painted in this speech report she was getting. But that evaluation was based on a single test and a 30-minute observation in a busy classroom. So mum was left wondering, well, what do I do? How do I bring this up without being dismissed? How do I explain what I'm seeing without being told that I'm wrong by the experts? It's a tough spot to be in, isn't it? And she's not alone. Many parents feel this disconnect when their child's real world challenges aren't really showing up in neat test scores or brief snapshots. So I'm going to say the answer could be no, that's wrong. Because average on a test is just that. It's average on one test. We need a lot more information than that to determine a child's needs and supports. And that's why we're here today, to shine a spotlight on the evaluation process. So we're not just going to run through a list of tests and checkboxes. What we're really going to do is we're going to dig into the why behind evaluations. So what is the purpose of a comprehensive special education evaluation? What you as a parent can ask for and how to figure that out. Information that you can share or your child can share. How to make sense of the results and what happens next. Are there any questions at this point, Nancy?
Nope, not yet. If anyone has
Uh,
questions along the way, you can put them in the chat and I'll be sure to share them with our presenter.
Okay, and I will pause at intervals to give people a chance to ask questions as well. Okay, so let's think about the purpose of a comprehensive educational evaluation. The main purpose is basically to determine whether a student has a disability under one of the 13 IDEA classifications, for example, autism or a specific learning disability, and whether or not that disability is having an adverse effect on learning. It's not just about labels though. So the evaluation highlights strengths and needs. So we're including things like how a student thinks, how they communicate, how they remember things, how they pay attention, and so on. It is supposed to identify if a disability is present and if the student qualifies for an IEP or a 504 plan, but it should also show how learning or behavior challenges affect classroom performance, like reading, writing, or staying focused. It should guide the development of support services and goals tailored to the student's needs. And finally, it should build a shared understanding among families, teachers, and specialists to support student success, which is why we need to be able to understand those evaluations. Most educational evaluations are going to include the following. So what we're going to look at here is that column on the left of your screen that says social history, psychological evaluation, educational, and so on and so forth. Okay. If you actually look at the IDEA, it lays out that you need to include these evaluations. So social history is basically a conversation about your child's early development. So pregnancy, birth, milestones, when did they walk, when did they talk, and your concerns as a parent. So your input's very important in the social history section. Then we have a psychological evaluation, and this usually includes an IQ test. In most cases in New York State, it's going to be the WISC, unless your child's a bit younger, and we'll talk about that later. And this is designed to help you understand and the school understand how your child thinks, solves problems, and processes information. Then, under educational evaluation, you usually will get broad educational testing, and usually this will be a Woodcock-Johnson or a Wyatt. And tools like the Woodcock-Johnson and Wyatt look at academic skills. So they're looking at reading, writing, math, and this is really helping to show where your child is doing well and where they might need help. And then we have classroom observations. These involve a team member visiting your child's class to see how they focus, follow directions, interact with others in the classroom in a typical school day. And finally, other assessments as needed or other relevant testing. And depending on the concerns that have been raised, these might include speech language testing, occupational or physical therapy assessments, behavior or emotional rating scales. Those are to understand things like anxiety, attention, social skills. However, this is not necessarily sufficient data to really determine a child's needs. We need to think of it as if we're putting together a puzzle. So we're not going to get the full picture if there are any pieces missing. So other data that could be relevant includes family history, which could go into the social history, but I want to separate it out because If, for example, there's a history of dyslexia in the family, that is an important piece of the puzzle. So it needs to be included. Other data that we look at, private testing and evaluations, although they're private and you may have paid a lot of money for them, they do not dictate the need for IEP services. I need to make that clear. And the district does not have to abide by their findings or recommendations, but they can look at them and they should take them into consideration, because that information really matters, as does your child's viewpoint. By the way, you're not obliged to submit private evaluations if you have them, that's your choice, but do bear in mind that you may be holding back information that may help your child. And when we're talking about the child's viewpoint, who better to give an accurate indication of what a child can or can't do than the child themselves? So we want to have a conversation with the children and convey that information to the Committee for Special Education. If the child's needs are really complex, one classroom observation might not actually be sufficient. The data is going to be more useful if your child's been observed in a couple of environments, for example, the one where they're most successful, or the one where, and I should say, the one where they're least successful, or one at the beginning of the day and one at the end of the day when they're more tired. And finally, you can, if you're comfortable doing so, video or record your child to prove evidence of need. Remember that parent we spoke about at the beginning, the one who felt that the speech report did not reflect the true nature of her son's difficulties? Well, with her, one of the solutions that we came up with and discussed was recording her son at a family gathering so that the Committee for Special Education could see that he was not, in fact, generalizing the skills taught in speech therapy. Any questions at this stage?
Not yet.
Okay. Okay. I'll try to slow down a little bit, everyone. Sorry if I'm going a bit fast. Knowing what evaluations to ask for is really overwhelming, but you're not alone, okay? And there is a way, there's a system you can use to figure out what assessments might help uncover your child's needs and ensure that they get the right support. So we would suggest that you start by learning everything you can about your child's primary diagnosis. So ADHD or dyslexia or autism, you want to go and find out, read the books, talk to other people, find out what you can. Anxiety is another one. Because if you understand how that disability typically affects learning, behavior, communication, etc., that's going to help you spot the areas that might need further evaluation. And bear in mind, many children have more than one area of difficulty. For example, a child with ADHD may also struggle with anxiety, or dysgraphia, or dyslexia, or working memory issues. So even though the child has ADHD, we want to be exploring those other areas if we see signs of struggles there. So what you can do is you can look up common co-occurring conditions and take note of anything that sounds like your child. You can also go through past assessments that have been done if your child's had an IEP for some time and look for any areas that were not tested. This ties in with you looking at, possible comorbidities that we were talking about just before. You can look for sections that were marked within normal limits, and yet you feel that in real life there is still a challenge there. Or you can look at gaps in time, because skills do change over time. So a 3-year-old evaluation may be outdated. And as you know, when we get to that 3-year point, you would normally be getting a re-evaluation anyway. You can also check out trusted websites. So 2 that we recommend are understood.org and Wright's Law. There are many more out there. Understood in particular really stands out. Or you can look at the State Department of Education website, because all of these will list some evaluation types and what they assess. And these can help you to match your child's symptoms to the right assessments. Those of us who work in parent and training and information centres know, just because of the work that we do, what evaluations are often overlooked. So I can tell you straight off the top of my head that I'm often talking to parents of children with ADHD or autism who've never had a sensory profile done, which blows my mind, because sensory issues are very closely tied in with both of those disabilities. So one of the things you can do is you can call the Parent Training and Information Centre And they can help you not only to identify the evaluations, but to request them in a way that the schools are more likely to honour. So you can call us and you can say, well, what evaluations do we typically recommend for students with challenges like my child's, or what's worked in similar cases? Another great resource is other parents. So either parents in local or online support groups who can be an incredible resource, but you will want to double check that the information is correct, or friends. And you can be talking to them and asking them which evaluations helped you better understand your child's needs, or what did your child struggle with that wasn't caught the first time around. All of this is giving you valuable information. Let's
We
look
do
at the
have a
actual
couple of
testing.
questions now,
Yeah,
Fiona.
yeah.
If a child has private testing and is found to be on the autism spectrum, can the school reject those results even though they are not test, even though they did not test for ASD?
Yes. So yes and no. So the school is going to do its own evaluations, first of all. They will look at private evaluations, they will take them into account, but unless they have tangible evidence that your child's disability is adversely affecting their ability to learn, then they are not necessarily going to go with the recommendations in the report from that clinician.
Is the school obligated to evaluate a homeschooled student for special ed services if the student is not vaccinated and does not have a medical exemption?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know about the vaccination side of things. I'm sorry. That is something I will look up and get back to you via email on, and maybe that can go out tomorrow with a copy of this. Um, Certainly, if a child is homeschooled and they are enrolled in the district, then yes, the school should be evaluating them. But I
One other
don't know.
question.
Yeah,
Um, if you're out of school, who can do a sensory evaluation?
an occupational therapist.
Mhm.
And it's not so much an evaluation as a profile. So it's a series of questions, and it's like, to what extent does your child experience these things? But yeah, it's something that would be done by and large by an occupational therapist. Okay, shall
And
I
that's it for now.
continue? Okay,
Sure.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Okay, so these are some of the most widely used testing tools in New York State, and to be honest, across the rest of the country, but particularly here in New York State. So psychological tests really, and we've talked about this a little bit already, but I'm just going to revisit this because there's a lot of information here. They look at how a student thinks, learns, remembers, and solves problems to identify learning strengths and thinking patterns. And so most of the time, what you're going to see there is the WISC. This is the school age one. The WPPSI or WIPSI is used for younger children. And the Stanford Binet is a slightly more effective tool if you're looking at students with intellectual disabilities. Academic evaluations, they look at how the student's doing in reading, writing, and math, and they pinpoint academic gaps, and they can help identify learning disabilities. But I want to emphasize that the Woodcock Johnson and the Wyatt 3 are broad evaluations. Speech language testing checks how well, obviously, a student understands and uses language. Fine motor testing measures hand coordination, visual motor skills needed for writing and classroom tasks. It may be used with students who are struggling with handwriting, but also with tool use, like using scissors, for example. Gross motor assessments look at movement, balance, and coordination to determine if physical support is needed. Sensory processing measures, which we were just talking about, look at how students respond to sounds, textures, movement, and more. So they're really useful for understanding behavior, focus, and comfort in the classroom. And by the way, when we talk about sensory issues, we're not just talking about somebody who doesn't like itchy clothing, for example. The sensory issues actually cover about 8 domains. And so there is vestibular processing, for example, and proprioceptive input, which we talk about in some of our other webinars. So you may not be aware. You may think, oh, well, my child's okay. They're not a picky eater. They don't have issues with textures in clothing, but it may still be worth looking into it. especially if they have an ADHD or autism diagnosis. Emotional behavioral scales, they explore emotional regulation, attention, behavior, and executive functioning to help guide behavioral supports and social emotional interventions. And then last but not least, adaptive behavior assessments evaluate how well a student handles everyday tasks and independence. So they're important for identifying functional needs and life skill deficits. So these would be particularly useful with students with developmental disabilities like autism. If you want to dive a bit deeper to truly understand a student's strengths and challenges in reading, for example, we often need more than just that general academic test. While those tests offer helpful subtests in reading, so I'm talking again about the Wyatt and the Woodcock-Johnson here, and you see them featured in this list in front of you, they're asterisked because they are those general tests, so they have those subtests we're talking about. They don't always provide the full picture. That's why you may need more targeted assessments like the CTOP2, which is phonological processing, or the Towery 2, which is for word reading fluency. These dig deeper and they help pinpoint where the difficulties stem from decoding, which is the ability to look at a group of letters and figure out what word they are forming, fluency, or comprehension. So what we're really doing here is we're digging deeper to make sure that any supports or services we provide are more closely matched to that student's specific needs. To fully understand a student's writing challenges, schools look at more than just spelling or grammar, which again can be addressed in that broader academic testing. So again, you'll see that here in this list. But if we're going to have a well-rounded writing evaluation, we want to explore how students generate ideas, organize their thoughts, form sentences, and how they physically write. Do they have an issue with the grip on the pencil, for example? So that's why different specialists are involved here. Special education evaluators tend to look at the writing content and structure. Speech language pathologists will look and see if any language or planning issues are getting in the way. And then occupational therapists can assess whether fine motor skills or handwriting difficulties are making writing harder. And each perspective is helping us build that much clearer picture of the student's learning profile. And then if we look at maths, question, or are we good?
We do have a few questions.
Yeah.
If a child is refusing to go to school due to behavioral issues, can an IEP evaluation be done at an outside place like a library?
I believe that would be possible, but it would be very much at the discretion of the school district. It would depend how closely they're working with the family in that instance. It's entirely feasible. We're talking about a student here who has a particular fear or phobia of the school building, I'm assuming.
Mm-hmm.
So another thing they may be able to do is do some of the assessments virtually, but there are, some evaluations lend themselves better to a virtual setting than others. So I would be having a conversation with the school district about that to see if they can meet you halfway.
And then one more question. If a student has a fine motor skills deficit, does it make sense to ask for an assistive technology assessment to foster more independence? For instance, for the student to not need a scribe. Same for reading. Maybe a student could benefit from text to speech technology.
Absolutely, and I'm really glad you asked that question. My colleagues and I feel strongly that assistive tech evaluation is almost these days vital for all students, and we're really hoping that at some point in the future it becomes one of those core areas of any full-scale educational evaluation. So yes.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So we're just going to quickly move on to math here. When a student's struggling in math, we need to look at which part of math they're struggling with, because it could be solving equations, which is obviously something a little bit more technical and difficult, something I had a problem with at school, or it could be something really basic like remembering math facts or understanding how numbers relate to each other. So that is again why schools use a mixture of evaluations so that they can look at computation and math fluency, which is how fast and accurately students solve problems, quantitative reasoning, which is applying math in real world contexts, cognitive processing, which is how the brain handles math related tasks. And again, these assessments are often led by special education evaluators, so that might be a special ed teacher and school psychologists working together. What I do want to bring to your attention here is occasionally you're going to have a student pop up that has dyscalculia. Dyscalculia, the estimate is about 3 to 7% of the population may have dyscalculia. That's about 1 in 20 children in every classroom on average. And dyscalculia is a real challenge to remediate because it comes back to those foundational aspects of math learning. So kids with dyscalculia will even have difficulty trying to count these dots as quickly as their peers. Or if you were to show them these numbers and say which is larger, which is taller, obviously the 3 is taller than the 8. But if you then show them numbers the same size and say which is greater, they cannot tell you whether a 9 is more than 7. And students with dyscalculia require a huge amount of repetition, and they require tangible ways of looking at math problems. So they need manipulatives, they need an awful lot of help, and oftentimes they will appear to get it, and then the next day they've just completely forgotten it. Okay. In addition to academic skills, schools can assess other important areas that impact learning and classroom success. For example, a speech language pathologist might evaluate a student's pragmatic language. That would be to determine the need for social skills support. So that would be, for example, students with autism. An occupational therapist may observe how a student navigates daily routines in school to see if there are any challenges with motor skills or sensory processing or attention or independence. And then they will recommend strategies or supports to improve that participation and success. And then a school psychologist or other evaluator may look at executive functioning, attention, or behavior to better understand challenges with focus and flexibility. Those are just a few examples of how schools can help evaluate the whole child. Was there another question, Nancy?
No, not yet.
Okay. So, contrary to what you may have heard, schools are on the lookout for students who struggle. They really are. And they do that so that they can put academic supports in place. The idea being that many students may need help from time to time, but their level of need doesn't always warrant an IEP or a 504 plan. So you've probably heard of iReady or STAR, which are broad computer-based tests that students take a few times a year. They are computer-based and they adapt to each student's answers, and they provide a general snapshot of academic strengths and areas for growth, and schools will send out intermittent reports on those. But when teachers need a bit more targeted information to guide day-to-day instruction and track progress, they can use curriculum-based measures, which can be referred to as CBMs, DIBELS, and AIMSweb. And these are really short, very skill-specific assessments that focus on things like how quickly a student can sound out words or solve basic math problems. They're quick, they're frequent, and they provide real-time data that helps teachers adjust instruction or provide extra support where needed. There's another tool, which is the 6+1 trait. And this is not a test, it's a writing rubric. And teachers can use that to give meaningful feedback because it highlights key areas like the ability to organize your ideas in writing and to find your voice in writing. So it helps students to grow as writers. So these are not comprehensive evaluations that we would use in a full-scale educational evaluation. However, they are day-to-day tools that schools use to keep an eye on students who may be struggling. And when they see those students struggling, they are likely to be referred for academic intervention, which is a less intensive form of support than a 504 plan or an IEP. And that's another subject for another day, but I just wanted to let you know that those are out there as well. A comprehensive special education evaluation. So this is when a student is actually referred to the Committee for Special Education and they have that 60-day timeline to evaluate and have a CSE meeting. That does two main things, as we've discussed. It determines whether a student has a disability, and it helps us understand how the disability impacts learning so we can provide the right support. Sometimes a school district's evaluation doesn't give a full picture of what a student needs to truly succeed. And that's important because without that information, it's really hard to ensure that your child gets a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, which is what they're entitled to. So if that happens, you have two options. You can request additional evaluations through the school, and if you're not sure what to request, you can follow the steps that we outlined earlier, or you can call an advocate or a parent training and information centre. Or you can seek an independent educational evaluation at the district's expense. I would always go for requesting the additional evaluations first. An independent educational evaluation is expensive. It comes out of the school's funding. Sometimes it's necessary. I'm not saying that you should never ask for that, but try to get the additional evaluations done by the school first. And if then we are still scratching our heads, or you feel that something has still been missed out, that's the point at which you can request what we call an IEE. Let's talk about something that we've all wondered, which comes up all the time when I'm working with parents. Do our opinions as parents really matter in the IEP process? Well, the honest answer is yes and no. Yes, because you and your child are legally recognised as equal members of the CSE, that's the Committee for Special Education. Your perspective is not just welcome, it's actually protected under federal law. You know your child best and your insights matter. So whether it's something you've noticed at home or a concern about behaviour or just a gut feeling that something's being missed, you absolutely do have a voice in the process and you need to use it. And yes, your concerns can and should be documented. There are sections throughout the IEP where parent comments can be included. So this is your space. Use it to speak to what you're seeing. So use it to say, my son's shutting down when it's time for math homework, or my daughter avoids writing and says it's painful, or my child reads well aloud, but they can't explain what they just read. Here's where the no comes in. Opinions alone are just not enough to drive services or support. What schools need is tangible evidence. So they need something observable, measurable, and documented. That could mean work samples that show a pattern, a private evaluation, a journal where you log behaviors, meltdowns, or missed assignments. When your concerns are backed by real examples of data, they carry way more weight in decision making. Now, I know that sounds like hard work. Keeping daily records can be really onerous, but you can also do the following. You can take photos or videos. Sometimes showing is more powerful than telling, so you could record your child getting frustrated with homework, refusing to write, melting down after school. You can take photos of messy handwriting, torn paper, incomplete work. You can use a notebook or a phone app to track patterns like school days missed due to anxiety or fatigue, or to time homework assignments. That's a really important thing to do. You can also keep examples of schoolwork that show gaps, for example, problems that have been skipped, or low scores, or an inconsistent performance, or avoidance where the kid's just like written, I don't get it, across the page, or strengths and weaknesses side by side as illustrated here. So you can see this kid has started out with a fabulous sentence. Lions are majestic creatures that dominate the African savannah. What a great sentence. It shows really advanced word choice. It shows strong oral language skills. But the effort that went into producing that sentence is not something that the student can sustain. So as we proceed through this report, we get, they eat meat, they live in Africa, they have baby cubs, lions are strong predator. Oh. So the rest of the report has no punctuation, inconsistent spelling, and poor sentence structure. That's reflective of someone who may have been taught some of the skills, has a good vocabulary, but the physical act of writing and organizing their thoughts is just overwhelming. You can also make a point of printing or saving anything a teacher shares about struggles with attention, organization, peer interaction, etc., and write down what your child says. If they say I'm dumb, tell the school that they think they're dumb. Tell them if they say everyone finishes before me. I hate reading, it makes my head hurt. This is all relevant data. And these statements in particular, coming from your child, reflect emotional impact, and they can really support the case for services. So bringing this kind of evidence to your IEP or evaluation meeting helps to show not just that your child is struggling, but how it affects their learning and why support is needed. So we're now going to move on to interpreting results. I'm just going to check with Nancy if there are any questions after that last section.
Yeah, we had a couple questions. How often should evaluations be updated? And is the timeline 60 days from referral or 60 days from when the parent signs the consent form?
60 days from signing the consent to evaluate. And in terms of how often they should take place, you have your initial evaluation. If that evaluation is sufficient, then you're going to hopefully have an IEP or a 504 plan in place. If you have an IEP, it has to be reviewed every 3 years. That's part of the system. And so every 3 years, you can expect a new set of evaluations to take place. And they should be similar to the original ones, unless we have tangible evidence that one of those need areas has been resolved in the meantime. And tangible evidence would be something like they met their goals, for 2 years consecutively, and they no longer need that support. Or we get that new testing, and the testing shows that they no longer have a deficit in that area. Sometimes you're going to need testing in between that 3-year period. So, a couple of years down the line, if your child is really, really struggling and doesn't want to go into school, or their grades are really plummeting, that may be a time to request a program review. And part of that program review may involve asking for more evaluations. One thing to bear in mind is that you do not want to be having evaluations every 3 or 4 months, because that will negate the validity of the results. Some of them you need at least 6 months, and in many cases a year, before you can repeat that exact same test. That's why it's good to know what other tests are out there, so that if you have had relatively recent testing, there are alternatives that they can use.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So we're now going to talk about how to interpret the results, and the points that we really need to consider are these. Scoring. We need to understand what the numbers mean and how far they are from average. Subtests. These look at specific skills, not just overall scores, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that in a minute, and they reveal learning strengths and challenges. So as parents, we want that information as well, and we don't always get it. Context. The child's performance in those evaluations can be affected by all kinds of things. It could be the time of day, could be the environment, could be how they're feeling emotionally, could be the testing conditions. And then finally, what do the scores mean in terms of academic impact? How do they affect learning, and what supports is that student going to need? So we'll start by looking at scoring. And I would recommend that when you get evaluations and reports, you get some highlighters ready. And we always say, make a copy of anything that you receive. So you've got a clean copy that you can keep to one side, and you've got one that you can mark up. So say you're looking at a set of evaluations and scores. You've got the psychologist's report, you've got the special ed teacher's report, you've got the speech pathologist's report, and so on. You want to be able to pick out the strengths, the weaknesses, and I would say any areas that require further evaluation or explanation. So I have a system. I highlight things online. So on my screen, I can use green for anything that I feel is a positive or a strength. I will use red for anything that I feel is a serious deficit or area of concern. And then I might use yellow for something where I'm going to look into that a bit further because I need more information about it. And what you're going to see is, by and large, standard scores. You want those standard scores on there. If you're not seeing them, ask for them. That's unusual. The majority of schools are going to give you the standard scores. And you're going to see these on tests like WISC, WIAT, Woodcock Johnson, etc. And they are normed against the population. So when we say, if you look at that banding of scores there on the left-hand side under standard scores, we know that 85 to 115 is your average cluster. If you're like 110 and above, you're moving into that high average range. If you're below 90, you're moving into the low average range. If you have a score below 70, that is significantly below average. So this is a red flag for serious difficulty in a specific skill, like reading or writing or memory skills. However, if you have a score in between 80 and 89, which is basically low average, the student may just be managing, but they still may be at risk of falling behind if they don't get support. So we still want to keep an eye on those areas. So these can be used to qualify students for special education, especially if patterns of strengths and weaknesses are present. So we're seeing like major strengths and major weaknesses occurring. But they shouldn't be the only thing that we base them on. Percentiles are another way to interpret scores. And as you can see, they tie in with the standard scores. So for example, if you have a score in the 73rd percentile, that corresponds to a standard score of 108. So that's bang on average, okay? And what that actually means, if you want to look at it in concrete terms, is that in a room of 100 kids, if your kid's in the 73rd percentile, it means 72 kids would score lower than your child and 27 would score higher than your child. And then we have T-scores. These are used in behavior, social, emotional, and executive function rating scales. So things like BASC, BRIEF, Conners. And a T-score of 70 or more is very significant, as it likely impacts daily functioning or learning to a significant degree. If we look at a T-score of 60 to 64, that's deemed to be at risk or slightly elevated. So it's really important to keep an eye on students with these scores, as they may need some additional classroom-based support, or they may need counselling support, because a lot of this will be related to emotions and behaviour. So really, just to summarize this section, if a student has standard scores in the 70s, they're going to be struggling academically, almost inevitably. If they have T-scores over 70, they're likely to be struggling emotionally or behaviorally to a significant extent. And if they have percentiles in, say, let's say, the 2nd to the 9th range or 8th range, this shows they're behind most peers. Something to note here. We have all got a different profile. Okay? If someone were to do a full range of testing on me today, I would probably have a range of scores, and 1 or 2 might even be notable. I might, for example, have a low auditory processing score, because that's an area I struggle with, or a low writing speed score, because I'm left-handed and my writing is absolutely dreadful. That does not mean I'd get an IEP if I were in school. For that, we're going to need a heck of a lot more evidence demonstrating that those low scores have a significant impact on my ability to learn. So we're not just going to base decisions on those scores alone. Subtests. So when you look at an IEP, you'll often find the results from the WISC, because pretty much everyone who's got an IEP has had a WISC, especially if they're school age. And the scores are usually broken down like this. So you can see we've got fluid reasoning. I don't know why they put them in this order, by the way. You'd think they put full scale IQ at the top because it's based on all of the other scores. But we've got fluid reasoning, full scale IQ, processing speed, verbal comprehension, visual spatial, and working memory. And using my system, I have highlighted processing speed and working memory because they are really low. If you remember, a score below 70 is concerning. But I've also highlighted fluid reasoning and full scale IQ because they are on the lower side. So this is useful information. It tells us that the student has a significant weakness in processing speed, and this means he or she, excuse me, this means that they may take much longer on timed assignments or tests. Also means they might struggle with copying from the board, and it may well appear that they're very slow to finish tasks, or they're distracted, even if they understand the material. And this student also has a significant weakness in working memory. So this means they might have trouble following multi-step directions. They might struggle to remember what they need to do next. So these are the kids that are going to need really frequent reminders or visual supports in order to stay on track. But wait, there's more. And this is where the subtests come in. So we have those 5 areas we just discussed: fluid reasoning, processing speed, verbal comprehension, visual spatial, working memory. And you'll see in brackets afterwards, it says composite score. Those scores are added up to give us a full scale IQ, or they're averaged out rather to give us a full scale IQ. But they're actually based, each of those areas, on 2 tests. And you can see those tests laid out here. Okay, so how about we break down the processing speed score? And if we do that, this is just an example, but it illustrates the point. We could find that the actual processing speed score, while the total is 69, it's based on the coding test where the child got a 75 and symbol search where they got 55. So they're both low scores, but clearly here the biggest struggle lies with symbol search. And what does that mean? It means very weak visual attention and scanning ability. So this could be a kid that struggles with tracking lines of text or finding key details in written material or handling visually dense work charts or sheets. This is really important because coding relies more on motor skills to get the score there. So we know that if we're going to focus our attention in on processing speed here, we really need to be looking at the visual element. And again, it just helps us to get that comprehensive picture of what's going on. Test scores do not always tell the full story. We were talking about context a bit earlier, and I said that the child's performance could be affected by many factors, such as their comfort with the evaluator, fatigue, testing outside the classroom, stress, and anything like this can cause the student to underperform, even if their real life skills are stronger. Conversely, students with autism and ADHD, with them, the opposite can happen. They may overperform in a quiet one-on-one testing setting where distractions are limited and demands are clear. In contrast, when they're back in an unpredictable classroom with the kids shuffling around and chairs moving, people going in and out, maybe the hum of computers, that can overwhelm them. And then it's much harder for them to show what they know. So we need to take that into account when we're looking at results. And that's why it's absolutely essential to combine test results with classroom observations, teacher and parent input, and a clear understanding of where the child is at and what their daily functioning is like, because that's how we're going to get supports that are truly individualized and effective. And then academic impact. Let's go back to that excerpt from the speech language report that we saw at the beginning. When we actually break it down, that student's language sample showed delays in grammar and sentence structure. And note that phrase, the mean length of utterance was 4.2, which is below age expectations. What does that actually mean? Well, according to this particular measurement, a student might say, he eating his cookie. That's not age appropriate for this student. What would be more age appropriate is he is eating his chocolate cookie. So when we say the mean length of utterance was shorter than it should have been, they're basically using shorter and fewer words than their peers. And what are the implications of that? That tells us that the student may need these supports. They may need some speech language therapy to build sentence structure and verb use. They may need some accommodations like visuals, sentence starters in the classroom, extra time and modeling for oral and written expression. Modeling means literally showing what we're trying to work towards. So if, for example, the student's being asked to write a few sentences about their weekend, you might show them an example of what you're actually looking for. So another child's account, or the teacher may put together an account of the weekend showing what they're after. And ideally, they might color code it to make certain aspects of it stand out so the child can really clue into what's needed. So these supports They may be IEP supports, they may be 504 plan supports. It depends on how the language delay is affecting learning in this instance. Sometimes testing actually raises more questions as well. So going back to the beginning of this webinar, and we were talking about the kind of approach most schools take to doing a comprehensive special education evaluation. Excuse me, tripping over my words here. Most evaluations that we see coming in will have a WISC and either a Wyatt or a Woodcock-Johnson. Regardless of what the issues were that led to the child being referred in the first place, we are going to see these. But sometimes these are the only things we see. And this is not for nefarious reasons. This is because schools are pressured for time, resources, etc., etc. And so, you know, this may be adequate with some students, but not with all. So if we look at this particular instance, you can see I've got my orange is a concern, red is a significant concern, and green is a major strength here. And we're seeing something quite interesting. We're seeing a student who demonstrates exceptional verbal reasoning skills. She's got 130 on verbal comprehension. That's in the superior range. But her working memory and processing speed are significantly below average, which is likely affecting her ability to follow multi-step directions, retain new information, and complete tasks efficiently. And then she also has a pseudo word decoding score of 72. A pseudo word is literally a made-up word. It's not a real word. But if you have good decoding skills, you should be able to still sound that word out. This student really struggles with that. And the score, okay, it's borderline average, but we're still really kind of close to an area where we're seeing a serious difficulty here. And that suggests that there could be a core weakness with phonological processing, and that's going to impact her reading accuracy, her fluency, it may impact her spelling. However, despite some of these difficulties she's having, she's got this relative strength with reading comprehension. High average. Now that could well be because she has very strong verbal skills and can use context to figure things out. So what we're seeing here is a student with a very uneven cognitive and academic profile, which can significantly affect daily functioning in the classroom, even though we can see here that this student is clearly bright in some areas. So let's factor in some more information. Let's assume that this is a student who comes home from school shattered each day. The teacher thinks she's capable of more, and she has an uncle and an older brother with significant learning disabilities. These are really important contextual factors that strengthen the case for further investigation and targeted support. So in this instance, we're going to surmise that the Committee for Special Education looked at these results and said, we're going to investigate this further. We're going to do a CTOP, which is a comprehensive test of phonological processing. We're going to do a GORP, which is a great oral reading test. We're going to have a look at her processing in terms of how quickly can she name things. We're going to look at her vocabulary by using pictures and seeing if she can identify complex pictures with complex vocabulary. We're going to look at work samples. We're going to look at time spent on homework. Is she spending an average amount of time on homework? We should be able to check that out with the teacher. Or is she spending twice as long as she should? We might want the parent to take them to see an optician because sometimes these issues can be related to visual issues. We want to have a chat with the student. And maybe we're going to observe that student in a couple of classes. Let's try doing social studies in the morning, which is an area that she's quite interested in. Oh, but ELA is the last lesson of the day, so let's go into ELA as well. And what we find in this instance, theoretically, is that that additional data that we've collected reinforces the fact that it is an incredibly uneven learning profile. So it's marked by exceptional strengths in language, comprehension, and vocabulary, but we've got significant deficits in phonological processing, decoding, cognitive efficiency, etc. And profiles like that are really common in students with specific learning disabilities, particularly dyslexia. And they often go unidentified without detailed testing because strong language skills can mask underlying difficulties. Now I'm going to look at the implications. So the student we just looked at just now, this imaginary student, is probably going to need some small group reading support. They're going to need some structured literacy intervention. It's going to have to be explicit, multisensory, sequential, and cumulative. In other words, we're going to really, really dig down, find out what this student knows and doesn't know, and we're going to systematically work to build that knowledge and information. The type of program that would do this is Orton Gillingham is actually an approach, it's not a program, but Orton Gillingham methodology, or Wilson, or Lindemood Bell, or Sonday. There's a whole load of programs out there. This can be delivered through small group or one-to-one reading support. But the student is also having to deal not just with reading, but or ELA, but going into other classes. So pre-teaching of vocabulary and content is going to help. And she could have that, for example, in resource room. And that's really going to ease the burden that she currently has of trying to decode unfamiliar words, the difficulties that she has with reading. In addition to that, we can have some classroom accommodation. So we can have extended time for reading and writing, audio books or text-to-speech tools like Learning Ally or Bookshare, alternative ways to demonstrate knowledge. That would be things like giving a speech instead of a written report, access to teach notes or reduced copying tasks, chunk directions and visual reminders. But don't forget the emotional impact this can have on a student. So we also need to be thinking about, does this student maybe need some counselling or check-ins if signs of frustration, avoidance or anxiety are observed? And also, if she's been dealing with this for some time, say she's just going into 4th grade and she's only just been evaluated, she's going to need a heck of a lot of validation and positive reinforcement, because she's just spent the first 3 or 4 years of her school life acutely aware that she has some strengths, but she also has these significant struggles that everybody can see. And our objective here is to give her whatever support and skills she needs to close the gap. So, what are our takeaways? When it comes to understanding how a student learns, we need more than just a quick snapshot. So evaluation should be comprehensive, which means looking at cognitive strengths and weaknesses, academic skills, behavior, speech, language, and how the student functions in the classroom. We don't want to miss anything that could be getting in the way of learning. 2, do your research. Learn what the different tests measure, ask questions, and talk to experts if you're unsure. Knowledge is power. And in special education, it can make all the difference in advocating for the right supports. And 3, you can always request more data. If something doesn't make sense, or if you feel a concern wasn't fully explored, you have the right to ask for more testing, more observations, or clarification. Because when it comes to your child's education, informed advocacy isn't extra, it's essential. You really need it. And I know it's a huge burden on you as parents, but I hope that this has helped you a little. And that's it. So here are our contact details, and I'm going to put my camera back on in case there are any more questions. I do know it's 1 minute to 1 o'clock. So I know a lot of you will have places to be, but I'm happy to stay online if people have questions.
We have a couple questions here. Let's see. And a couple comments. Someone said it's a good note to be sure that the child's eye testing and hearing is kept up with, and if questionable, to seek tests by a doctor. A child's could be brewing a sensory complication that would be showing some difficulties too. Let's see. Is there a difference when interpreting scores of a 2E student, a student who struggles but does very well academically?
I wouldn't say it's so much it's a difference in interpreting scores. Sometimes you're just going to have to pull together a lot more information. So with a student like that, either you're going to find that may be the student where you're needing that IEE, the independent educational evaluation, or we're going to have to really kind of spread the net a bit wider in terms of the testing that we do with that student. And also that student hopefully would be able to articulate a little bit more clearly what they are experiencing. And we really want to be paying attention to them if they're in that particular scenario.
And just so folks know, a 2E is a twice exceptional student. We do have some webinars on our YouTube channel that were done recently about folks that are twice exceptional students. So please check that out. And I'll put the link in the chat in a moment and send it with the information that we've given today. A couple things. How or where do you locate the T-score?
The T-score should be on the report. So if your child has done a Connors or a BASC or a brief, the BASC and brief are the emotional ones, there should be T-scores on the report.
With shortages of, sorry, with shortages of, yeah, it should be right there. With shortages of speech language folks and other therapists in any districts, will most districts actually go that extra mile without parent advocacy?
I don't want to speak for districts. Some do it better than others. It's you know, it's down, the advocacy is a really big part of the picture. Yes, some districts will go that extra mile. It really depends on who is running the special education department, how much training and experience they've got. You know, I know, for example, that a director of pupil personnel services in one of the districts in Westchester is a former neuropsychologist or psychologist. So she knows what to look for. And so she digs deep. But it depends entirely on the district. But either way, you need to be an effective advocate regardless. Absolutely. Because you want to model that advocacy for your child, because one day they're going to be an adult and they need to advocate for themselves.
Very good point. When is a good time to present outside neuropsych to the district? It is almost the end of the year. Children have school avoidance, autism, anxiety. This child is 7 years old and refused to do any kind of homework. We asked for a 10-week review into the new year, and the current teacher is of no help. I suspect that she is not either recognizing the struggles or discard when struggles are brought up. Teachers being informed when the struggles occur, and there's a trail of emails. Any suggestions?
So this really depends on the context. First of all, I don't know if this child has an IEP already or not. I mean, I would be sharing that neuropsych evaluation. Personally, I would share that ASAP. If the child has not had a full-scale comprehensive educational evaluation yet, then they need one now. So I would be making my request to the Committee for Special Education, and given how late we are in the year, I would be taking that written request into the office with a copy, getting a stamped copy of it so that we know when the school district received it, and asking if I can sign the consent to evaluate there and then, because that's going to expedite the process. In terms of people not responding, I would be inclined to say, you know, give them 48 to 72 hours and then write another email and take it up the chain. So add, you know, if you've spoken to the classroom teacher and you've got nowhere and your child does have an IEP, then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to include the CSE chair. And then if the CSE chair doesn't get back to you, then we're going to go to the Director of Pupil Personnel Services and add them into the email chain, and so on and so forth.
Okay. What kind of testing is needed for listening and reading comprehension?
Listening comprehension, you've got me stumped there, I have to say. For reading comprehension, it's going to be things like the Grey Oral Reading Test. There's also I think it's the Grey Silent Reading Test. So you'll have those in we're going to send you this, obviously, so you'll have a copy of the test that we listed out. But there are more tests out there. So Understood is really good at giving lists of tests for specific areas of deficit. So I'm pretty certain if you went and just put into Google Understood listening comprehension evaluations, you may get an answer there. Or you could use AI, use ChatGPT. That's going to get you the answers really quickly. If you're doing research, ChatGPT is useful. Just make sure that whatever you find, you back it up and make sure it's factual.
Hmm. Do you think that most ophthalmologists could test for visual tracking, or would parents need to seek out a different provider?
That again, I cannot give you a an informed answer on that. That's not something I'm hugely familiar with. Some of the tests that occupational therapists use do cover visual motor integration, for example. So that's tracking to a degree. But for more complex optical issues, either you're going to go to an optician or you're going to go to a specialist provider in ophthalmology. I don't have any names off the top of my head, but if that person is interested in that, they can reach out to our office, because I know that we do have the names of some providers that we can give to them.
Another person said that they think it's important for parents to know that school evaluations are not medical.
Correct.
Lots of
Yeah,
thank yous.
they can't
Very informative.
diagnose. So
Right.
schools can't diagnose dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyscalculia. But what they can do is they can identify the deficits in those areas. And if they can see that those definite deficits are significant, they can still put the appropriate accommodations and services in place. You don't need to have a diagnosis necessarily to get the supports. It's more about the school finding that evidence that it impacts your child's ability to learn.
When you encounter individuals or agencies who are fixated on IQ scores and cutoffs, example 71 is not qualified, 68 does qualify for services, what methods of communication have you found most effective to bring them around to understanding the need for more well rounded evaluations?
That's a tough one.
Mm.
Okay, I would say in that situation, probably you want to be reaching out to someone like us, the Parent Training and Information Centre, and have a conversation about how you're going to go back and talk to the school. Pulling together your own evidence, as we discussed during the presentation, is valid and something that you can do. Sometimes it may be a case of going to outside specialists and getting enlisting their support. But as I said earlier, even if it's a medical evaluation by a clinician, it doesn't necessarily mean that the school's going to deem that your child is eligible for an IEP. So again, it's down to individual circumstances. You know, is the school being belligerent and they just don't really understand the issues that your child has? Do you need to maybe go to to experts on the subject? So say your child has ADHD, for example, Attitude is an amazing website that provides a ton of information about ADHD. Not only do they provide information, they do workshops, they have a podcast. I would seek out those advocacy groups for your child's disability, because they will be good at helping you get a better grasp of what's going on and being able to convey that to the school and provide, or, you know, work with the school, because that's what we're always trying to do. We're trying to work with the schools to come to an understanding about the information that we need.
Here's a good question. How can I get my daughter with a 5 percentile average in working memory, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and ADHD exempt from a second language? She's going into the 6th grade.
Oh, okay.
Mm.
There's not specific guidance from New York State on this, as far as I'm aware. So some districts will just automatically deem that the students can be exempted from the foreign language. That happened with one of my kids, and he actually wanted to do the foreign language, so we had to go into the CSE and argue for him to do it. However, I have also come across cases where I don't really understand why, but schools will really put their foot down and say, no, this kid has to do the foreign language. I think part of it ties in with the fact that some colleges will not accept students if they haven't done a foreign language in middle and high school. But that is really, I think, that's why we have a committee for special education. It should be something that we sit and we discuss. And this is where the child's point of view really, really matters.
Yeah.
And we can talk about pulling together more evidence, or we can talk about trialing them with something. Okay, if you think they can cope with it, let's see if they can go into one class and see what happens. That kind of thing. It all comes back to evidence at the end of the day, and the more you have, the more compelling your argument is. And I'm sorry I couldn't be more specific on that one. If I could wave a wand, I would say any child in that situation where the child doesn't want them doing it and the parent doesn't want them doing it, the evidence really is there if they're in the 5th percentile, to be honest.
Yeah. We have some more, and I want you to know that I did leave a half an hour for questions, so we have time.
Okay.
I'm a community service provider who provides in-home therapy and case management services. How can service providers best support parents and coordinate with the schools to advocate for children's needs?
Okay, that's a bit more of a generalized question.
Mhm.
So as a service provider, sometimes service providers, for example, will refer people to our agency. So they'll refer, when they can see that a parent is struggling to communicate with the school, they'll refer them to us. So that's one thing that you can do. It's tricky because you're two separate entities basically, aren't you, as a service provider. You can provide written stuff though, that's for sure. If you, for example, if you are somebody running, I don't know, something like a sensory place, where children are going to get OT and sensory input, for example, there's nothing to stop you from supporting that parent by just writing down what you're seeing in that child. It doesn't have to necessarily be a formalized report or a clinician's report. Any observations of what the child is experiencing, in my view, are relevant. So that I'm sorry I can't give you a more detailed answer on that. That's going slightly outside the evaluations realm.
Mhm. What extra information would an IE bring for a child with a WISC that a WISC cannot be able to be calculated based on the CSE meeting for a kiddo with autism, 12 years old and with not fabulous speech production, a lot of echolalia and scripting, was told intelligence can never be discerned.
Okay, so for starters, Stanford Binet may be a better tool than the WISC to evaluate that child. If you have an independent educational evaluation, then they have way, way more tools at their disposal. And a good neuropsychologist is going to look at all of the information. So they're going to look at the IEP, they're going to look at everything you present to them as a parent, and then they're going to go to their battery of assessment tools, and they're really going to try and tailor what they do to your child. Does that mean that they will necessarily get reliable information denoting your child's actual level of functioning? No, not necessarily. And that can happen for all kinds of reasons with students with autism. If you look at, I mean, a non-verbal IQ test might be something that a neuropsychologist could use with them, for example, if they're not particularly verbal. But I'll give that as an example, actually. A non-verbal IQ test tends to be patterns. So you'll see a pattern and there'll be a missing piece, and you have to select the missing piece for that pattern. So obviously for the child to do that, they need to A, understand the purpose of the test, and B, they need to be thinking in the same way that the person who devised the test was thinking. And when you have a student with autism, they can have a very different outlook on things, and what might make sense to them as a pattern wouldn't necessarily make sense to the person that devised the test. So they may get a low score, and it's not at all reflective of their ability.
We had a comment, which I've seen this being approved, that ASL is considered a language. So if you have a student that might be having difficulty
That's
with
a
that
really
second,
good point. Yeah,
is
really good
great.
point.
Yeah. Another person said, my son recently, 10 years old, underwent a very thorough private neuropsych eval. The doctor strongly suggested that he receive direct instruction in executive functioning due to dyspraxia diagnosis. The school district's being very resistant to providing this. What else can we request to get them to see how necessary this service is? Sounds like you need an advocate.
It sounds to me like you need an advocate. So depending on what county you're in, you can call, I don't know them. I think there's people from all over in this particular webinar, but
Yeah.
see if you can find your local parent training and information center and give them a call. So with that, I would be looking at this is where I think things like video and photography can really be useful. You can look at the deficits that were highlighted in the neuropsych report, and you can look at the recommendations, and you can tie the two together and kind of say, okay, for example, they may have said, if your child's got dyspraxia, then they could have difficulties with using climbing equipment, for example. So you could go down to the local playground and you could record them trying to use the slide, trying to use the swing, trying to climb on a climbing frame. Or if it's more a fine motor skills thing, show how they use, again, video them using a pair of scissors or using a pencil or trying to play with Legos. This is going to, a lot of these things aren't necessarily going to show up in the classroom. They might show up more at home. And so that would be my recommendation there. And again, look at the testing that has been done in the neuropsych, see if there are some similar tests that you can ask the school to conduct that will still be valid because they weren't ones used by the neuropsychologist. Unfortunately,
Physician, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the range of tests, particularly for gross motor skills, is quite limited, unfortunately. The ones they have at school for sure. And some of them, you age out of them quite quickly. A lot of them stop at the age of 12.
As a physician, someone's asking, how can I support families to get access to parent advocates in my county?
Okay, the best thing I can suggest to you is that you either go on ChatGPT and see if there are parent training and information centers in your region. There should be one that covers your region if you're in New York, or you can reach out to our office and we work with a lot of parent training and information centers across the state. So if you are up Rochester way, for example, we would put you in touch with Starbridge. If you're in Buffalo, I think it's Parent of New York State. So if you're specifically looking for an area, I would say reach out to us or try and do your own research on that.
Let's see. So, I attempted to put the link into special ed for plain language. There's a lot of great information in there, and I will put that in your in the contact information that we'll send you afterwards with our evaluation. And if everyone could please fill out our evaluation, we really take this feedback seriously when we're organizing events. It helps us pick topics that are important to you all. So I do encourage you to please fill that out. Any last minute questions that anyone is dying to ask and just hasn't been able to ask yet? You're welcome to put it in the chat. Looks like we're pretty well done. Everyone's just saying thank you so much. You've really given us a lot of information. And I encourage folks to reach out to Putnam Independent Living Services if you have additional questions. Fiona's always happy to respond. Or you can contact Disability Rights New York, and we certainly can assist as well. Parent to Parent is another great advocacy organization throughout the state. You can certainly look those up as well. And we'll send you out some more resources and information, and the link to this webinar will be available if you have others that you would like to share that with. We encourage that. Oh, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Fiona. It was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot as well, and I really appreciate that. And
Very
we'll see
welcome.
you on our next event.
Okay. Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody. Have a
everyone.
great day. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.